So Alliance4Impact Impact17 and Meaningful Business have pulled together this webinar in response to requests from our business partners asking what they can do to help with the coronavirus response. So we asked some of our colleagues in other organisations to speak to you for 5 minutes each today. And hopefully in that short time, they'll be able to give some inspiration and lessons from their experience that will help. You'll then have a chance to ask them questions for clarification after they've spoken and maybe contribute some of your own ideas as well. So first we'll hear from Margaret Osborne from the Office of the Special Advisor to the United Nations Secretary General. Then we'll hear from representatives of 3 critical industries, from the supply chain industry, from news and information, and from the technology industry. So Hans-Peter Teufers from the UPS Foundation will talk about what they're doing now as an immediate response. Richard Bogie from News UK will talk to us about what businesses can do for their staff, for the community, and through their industry. Navroop will talk about what the tech industry is well positioned to do now and into the medium-term future. And then finally, we'll hear from Joel Schaefer from the World Health Organization, who will give some messages for businesses from the WHO Director General. So without further ado, we'll go straight to Margaret. Margaret, over to you.
Great, thanks, Andy. And thank you to the team at Alliance4Impact and Impact17 and Meaningful Business for putting this together. I'm from Dr. Ahmed Meraikhi's office. He's the, as Andy said, the special advisor to the Secretary General, and our mandate focuses mostly on public-private partnerships and supporting South-South cooperation. And I was asked to give a kind of overview about what businesses can do to support the coronavirus response. Personally, I don't think I'm in a position to tell businesses what they can or can't do. Businesses have a much better understanding of their operations and what they're able to do. That said, I think I can provide some food for thought on what some businesses have done and where you might be able to think about what you can do, what your business can do to support. Before you can talk about it, repurposing your business at all, you need to clearly identify the needs and know really what level of the response you can contribute to. The response is coming at multiple levels, but largely it's being driven at the country level, regionally, or sometimes the city level. This disjointed approach in terms of severity of the response, in terms of the timeline of how the response is being implemented, means that context is everything. You need to look about where your business is located and what the needs are in your geographical area, unless you're a large global business, and then you can look at a much broader level what you can do. And Hans-Peter from UPS is going to give us, their response and how they're integrating. I think you can look at them and take a lot from what they're doing. So internationally, if you can look at the WHO for guidance, Joel will later give us the things that they're working on and how you can get involved. At the country level, you want to look to national governments and local governments for their coordinated responses. And then internally, it sounds like Richard's going to give us more detail about what you can do internally to protect your own employees and your own local business environment. From an operational perspective, what you want to start doing is looking at how your business operates and rethinking it. You want to rethink how you're doing business and with whom you're doing business. How you're doing business is going to be things that you've seen in the media, like manufacturing. Zara in Spain reconfiguring their lines to make hospital gowns. The alcohol and perfume companies that have shifted to making hand sanitizer. Car companies making ventilators. If you're a curtain company and have textiles, perhaps you can reconfigure to make medical grade textiles. That's really about reconfiguring your internal operations from a manufacturing perspective. If you're a company that does research, whether it's scientific research or desk-based research, you might be able to help. You could look at supporting Italy's tackling their problems of trying to split ventilators to have 2 patients off of one ventilator, or looking at making ventilators out of readily available parts, and then giving that to where it's most in need. So R&D can contribute as well. Another how you're doing business area you might be able to help in is space. Hotels are becoming quarantine centers. If you have a location in space or a car park or any sort of space, you might be able to give power to local authorities to take over stores or car parks to become emergency centers or testing centers. That's one thing that we've started seeing that's becoming very, very used in the US particularly. Then you want to look at who you're rethink who you're doing business with. You can look at your workforce. Is there something that, because your business has had to cut back, is there something that your workforce can do to support the response? You can look at staff sharing opportunities. In Germany, Aldi has partnered with McDonald's, which is a unique partnership, and the Aldis will employ all of the McDonald's out of work employees to support the increased need for food delivery. Call centers in the UK that used to be answering calls are now for a tech support, are now answering calls to answer questions and direct people to appropriate response centers and governments. You also want to look at your supply chain and make sure that your supply chain is secure. If your own suppliers aren't diversified enough, then there's a large chance that their business will suffer and they'll shut down, which will ultimately affect you. So you want to look at how you can support your own supply chains to make sure they don't shut. If you're a tech company, you want to look at how you can support remote learning in terms of providing education, but also partnering with educational institutions or museums, and we've seen a lot of that happening. So really it's about rethinking the way that you've been doing things. You also want to look at getting involved in broader collaborative efforts. The World Economic Forum has a great website that has a list of the strategic initiatives that are going on the response, and that's a good resource to look at. In my role working with Dr. Meraikhi, he serves as the chair of the Global Humanitarian Action Executive Alliance, which is a group of companies. Hans Peter is one of the focal points for UPS, which is one of the founding members of this group. And it's a group of companies that have come together to engage collectively on and pool their knowledge and resources and expertise on responding to some of the humanitarian needs. Now, this group is in its infancy, so it's not really something that it can be engaged in yet, but the idea is that these initiatives exist. There are lots of initiatives out there that can serve as platforms for you to engage in and broader and look at other companies in your industry and your sector for how you can engage further. So I think I'll leave it there, and I look forward to hearing from everyone else. Over to you, Andy.
Thanks, Margaret. We'll keep the flow going. If anyone has any questions for Margaret and what she said, please put them in the chat function for now. But we'll go straight to Hans Peter.
What is good is to speak after Margaret, because I can say, I'm just echoing what she's saying, because most of the stuff she has lined up yet is true, no doubt, right? And it is definitely an unprecedented challenge that we are having currently with direct impact on all stakeholders. So it's not only that the company itself is affected to a certain extent because of customer bases and changes, but we have as well employees that are in the front line of work, and so we have to protect them on one hand, and on the other side, we are not thinking about repurposing business currently, because at the end of the day, the business model that we are running is exactly the business model that is dearly needed now, and that's what we are seeing each and every day with all the demands and the requests that are coming in. We have a long history of cooperating. So there are models like LET, Logistics Emergency Team, GHAEA, which Margaret is leading together with the group of Dr. Meraikhi, and we have others. And that is, of course, one of the really relevant pieces to consult stakeholder groups and discuss as well with other industries on what is the best response and how can we move forward to have the biggest impact. Because let's face it, at the end of the day, even if a company is spending a lot of money, for instance, for grants and logistics and transportation, it is a drop to a certain extent. So all of us have to make sure that we are using the funding that we are having in the best possible manner. So the consulting on response is, of course, massively activated with the West Pandemic Supply Chain Network, Private Sector Roundtables, COVID Action Platform, and more. And what we did directly in the beginning, because we are part of the critical infrastructure, was to extend our response program in committing to more than $6 million in grants, logistics, and transportation. And that is what is needed every day. We see it with the partners that we are working with, United Way, MCross, Salvation Army, and others. You see them listed up, so I don't want to respond. I don't want to repeat that. And in addition to that, we just, and Andy, if you can switch to the next slide, we just started to support the White House Rapid Response Task Force for coronavirus testing sites, as well with as part of the critical infrastructure. Now, internally, there's a control tower. We are trying to assess the changing priorities that are coming in each and every day, demands of partners, demands of customers, demands of UN organizations. We work, have to say that very clearly and loud, we currently work with the existing partners, so we are not building up additional partnerships because we are more or less, you know, at the bottom line with what we can bring to the table, especially when it comes to transportation needs. And last but not least, there will be a time after urgent needs and a time after urgent or building up urgent supply chains in order to protect and help countries that are in need yet. The question will then be, of course, is that supply chain that we are having the future supply chain, or do we need changes? What can be done better? And I was listening yesterday to assessments UNDRR offered best practices in China and Korea, very interesting pieces. So those are the things that we have to start thinking about. What is when we are changing the current curfews, opening up again, and then we will see most likely in a week or two from now, and that's probably then a better time, maybe in 2 or 3 weeks even, a better time to ask that question. How do we need to repurpose business, not only to fight COVID, but as well to survive the situation after COVID? I think that is the more relevant question right now. Thanks, Andy.
Thanks, Hans-Peter. We'll keep the momentum going, and we'll hand over to Richard.
Okay, thanks very much, Andy, and the other speakers. Good afternoon, and everybody. So I want to talk from the perspective of what we're doing as an industry. So we are News UK. I'm the managing director for 2 of our regions in Scotland and Ireland. We are news publishers, so our most well-known brands in the UK would be the Times of London, the Sunday Times, and the Sun. We also have radio businesses. So we've got national radio stations in Virgin Radio, TalkSport, Talk Radio. And throughout Ireland, we have a range of regional stations, 2 out of Dublin, Cork, Drogheda, Limerick, and other big cities and conurbations across Ireland. I think we have found that the most effective thing to do was a long time before the disaster came into play. We had comprehensive disaster recovery plans, which we didn't know what the disasters would be, but we felt certain that we needed to prepare for any eventuality. And that has stood us in good stead as this COVID crisis has emerged. When the beginnings of the news started coming out of China in December, we put together a task force in January that started looking forward and projecting what might be done. So as a business internally, we were able to move very quickly to working from home and moved extremely quickly to deploy technology that would enable us to do that. However, the issues became not just about us as a business, but our industry as a whole. Pretty much every jurisdiction across the world has recognized that the provision of well-curated, authenticated news presented in a method that can be understood by its audience and absorbed at their own time and pace is an essential service. So therefore, the most important thing that we've done in all three territories, UK and Wales working with Westminster government, in Scotland working with Holyrood, and in Ireland working with the Dublin governments, has been to work through our trade associations and bodies. And in that regard, our competitors that we would see in the normal day-to-day life are not our competitors at all. They are our allies in conversation with government. And government wants to hear what you have to say. Government are working very fast, in many cases scrambling to put structures and restrictions in place on movement and so forth, but they still want economies to work and information, in our case, to flow. So working through our trade bodies, we have found that access to government ministers, what would normally take 2-3 weeks to set up and be a very structured call, happens within hours, sometimes in less than that. The access, therefore, as an industry has been very good, and is our thoughts have been listened to, not always acted upon. There's a lot of pushback in some cases, but it has meant that we're able to keep publishing newspapers, driving our business through websites and online subscription services and broadcasting, despite massively changed working practices. So what is very different is that we have upwards of 90% of staff working from home, and our reliance on technology has become greater than ever before. And I think that brings me on to the next point, which is staff care. In a massively changed working environment, staff can very, very quickly get disconnected from the common purpose that you're working towards. And therefore, right at the very top of our agenda has been staff care. And I think that starts with communication. We have obviously the usual range of meetings and so forth you can take offline, but actually involving staff in every part of what you're trying to do, and the messages that are coming from the top, middle and bottom of any organizational structure has been very important. So we are running a series of weekly webinar type conversations, much like this one. Yesterday I was on one, it had 550 staff. We were taking questions, we were letting them know how we're working and getting messages across that are really important for individuals to know that firstly, we're taking a proactive approach to managing this crisis, that we have plans in place for here and now. But to Hans Peter's point, we are also starting to look towards the future and say, as we get out of crisis, how do we start to manage what is a new period of stability, and then also start to think about growth and how we can rebuild what will be a new business in a new landscape with new ways of working and new customers and new routes to market. So we want teams to start working on those things as well as handling the day-to-day crisis. In that conversation with our staff, we are also making sure that the vital messages about personal health and well-being are there. So working from home, issues around posture, around safe working spaces, around changed expectations of working hours. If you have children at home, you can't work to the same pattern. And saying that it's okay to work differently. You don't need to feel guilty about taking a break and stepping away from your maybe uncomfortable position. Andy's giving me time here, so I can move on. And I want to talk a bit about local community. We're doing a lot of work to help support charities that are suffering very badly, but also working with our local customers to say, how can we help and support you so that you are still here and still able to do business with us when we all get through this situation. So things like free advertising services and notice boards for businesses that are doing things for the health service in the UK. We're making sure we publicise those as much as possible. So thank you, Andy. Hopefully that's to time and it has been helpful.
Great, thank you very much, Richard. Yes, it was. Navroop, we'll give you 5 minutes as well.
Sure, thank you, Andy. Thanks everyone for joining today. My name is Navroop Sahdev, and I'm the founder and CEO of the Digital Economist, which is a global impact platform working on emerging technologies and bridging them to global businesses, and really what that means for a global economic transformation, and sort of bringing a lot of tools from economic science into the implementation of that. So it's actually a very interesting time for the tech industry. You know, given what we do is technology and emerging tech, turns out it's actually not a lot different for technologists from where it was to where it is now. We already are used to working from home, for example. So there isn't a huge shift, but there are some parts of, I should say, the business that are different. For example, fundraising, right? If you're a startup or if you're an entrepreneur, that is something that hasn't gone fully virtual yet. So those are some of the parts that are starting to shift. We are starting to see that shift. So roughly two sorts of responses that we are observing in this space. A is a bit of an inward response, which is like, you know, what can we do now, right? As the landscape, as the global landscape is shifting, and a lot of businesses are in fact preparing for a recession, and I'll come back to that point. And the other is of a more agile response, asking, well, how can we help? How can we help now, right? And that's also the resilience and perhaps even the anti-fragility of entrepreneurs, where they roll up their sleeves and they say, let's help out in any way we can. So what we're doing is squarely on the second block, and so what that means is that tech industry, from what we're observing, and really the intersections with entrepreneurship in general, and if most of your business is online already, you're actually very well positioned to help out in this crisis, both yourself as well as other industries and governments. So there are a lot of resources that you can access. In many ways you can help, for example, to the governments. There are repositories. You can sign up to volunteer. You can sign up to help with the efforts that governments are making, not just from like a physical standpoint, but also the technical infrastructure that is needed, data that is needed. If there's any capability or capacity you have in-house, now is a great time to actually put that to practice. So, and the beauty of technology is obviously that it's not constrained to geography. So that using that as a springboard, I think there's a lot of problem solving that is being done currently and can be done. Couple of examples would be a big group out of MIT and Harvard, and MGH and Government of India and others, a bunch of partners who are currently working on Safe Paths mobile app. So that traces where you've been and if you've come in contact with anyone with coronavirus, right? Now, there are other governments in other countries that have rolled out similar stuff, but obviously this has to be done in a privacy-preserving way and sort of not towards a surveillance stage. So the unique combination of privacy preserving infrastructure with mobile first, which is definitely an enabler at this point, is key here. So I have 3 points here. Thanks, Andy, with that, and that's really about, well, what is the future and what does that mean currently and moving forward for the tech space, right? So the truth is there's actually a lot more opportunity. The tech companies are actually a lot busier now than they were before the crisis. So what it is doing is forcing this urgency of relying on digital first. The tools that existed already, but now we are actually forced to use them. So we are going to see a lot of reshuffling of the global economy towards digital. So that's also something that we're working on at the Digital Economist and what that entails, right? And like I said, the digital battle against the virus is something that we're seeing entrepreneurs as emerge out of as the most agile and robust group in helping out, particularly here in the US. We're based in Washington, DC, and we're seeing a lot of efforts to help governments, to help civil society, folks working on the front lines. And finally, I think one of the key questions that we're working on, and a lot of colleagues, including the European Commission and others that I've been speaking to, are working on, is asking this question: can technology help us build anti-fragile systems? Now, what does that mean, right? There's fragility and there's robustness, which is something that doesn't change under stressors. But in fact, anti-fragile systems get stronger under stressors. So we see a lot of biological systems, in fact, for the most part, are anti-fragile. Now, it turns out humans are not very good at building artificial systems that are anti-fragile. So this open question around how can we build robust, resilient, but perhaps step further than that, anti-fragile systems, technology systems, in turn, that leads to economic and social anti-fragility, or at the very minimum robustness. Now is the time to sort of look into that, ask that, and build those structures. And so I'll leave Andy with that. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Navroop. So we heard from 3 very important industries, especially right now. And we heard from an overview from Margaret, and now it's a great privilege to be able to turn over to Joel Schaefer from the World Health Organization, and I think we can all appreciate it's such a busy time for them there, and we're grateful for any time they can spare to get across some key messages. Joel, over to you.
Thanks very much, Andy. Good day to everyone, and thank you very much for the invitation to join the call today. It is perhaps a unique circumstance, and what we're already seeing is that this is going to play out over a much longer time frame than could have been initially anticipated or predicted at the beginning of the outbreak. So that's a very important point for us to think of in planning for the weeks and months to come. Our Director General, Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, has focused on 5 key actions for business leaders. And thank you to the previous speakers who've covered a lot of this ground already. Happily, they're very consistent. And starting with protecting yourselves, your families, your staff, community, and clients in the best way possible, and drawing on the facts, the information, the guidance from WHO and from public health authorities to do that. It links very closely to the second key area, continuity, and we're already seeing in many places companies and businesses that have robust continuity plans, business plans, and putting those in place. Here is another area, key area, where business can help government, help local communities, where they have activated business continuity plans and where they can support, in some cases, overwhelmed public services. Information is key, as several speakers mentioned. Stay up to date. Follow the guidance of the World Health Organization and of national and local public health authorities. Our website, who.int, is the easiest reference to give you. You can find from there loads of information, and follow Dr. Tedros's press conferences. The next one will be tomorrow at 5 p.m. Central Eastern Time. Share this information widely with your networks, with your staff, with your clients, because this is also, as we've seen, a huge issue. There's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of information that grows out of panic, or people not finding what they need, or hearing different things from people that they may or may not believe around them. And so spreading good information, drawing on the official campaigns of WHO and of other health authorities is hugely important. If we can go to the next slide. Thanks, Andy. There are ways that you can contribute. In kind is a huge area that brings with it some complexities. But we are, as already mentioned by previous speakers, there are many players who are repurposing or finding ways that they can contribute in a different way, add to manufacturing capacity, add to supply chain capacity, bolster things that are, let's say, fragile or beginning to fail now, which is hugely important. And finally, financially, and here you may have seen the COVID-19 Solidarity Response Fund, which we launched just about 2 weeks ago, and which has been something for WHO that we have not been able to do before, in giving individuals and in many cases corporate donors some way to contribute to something like this. The response has been tremendous. We're deeply touched by the giving and the generosity, and it's important to note that this response fund will feed into the strategic preparedness and response plan, which is all actors. It's not just WHO. That plan is being revised right now because of the time frame that I mentioned earlier, and because we know this is going to play out over a much bigger scale and much longer time than has been anticipated. COVID-19 responsefund.org is where you will find more information. We've already seen more than 187,000 individuals and companies contribute there, and we're in the region of $95 million for the response fund. But there are many other ways to contribute, and to close, I'd just like to talk very, very briefly about the things that are needed and the things that are not needed. Top of the list, and you've heard Dr. Tedros say it again and again, solidarity. And previous speakers hinted at this as well. This kind of outbreak and challenge requires working together in a way that is perhaps not typical of our day-to-day. I think one speaker mentioned people we're sometimes in competition with, we have to work together with. And so this solidarity and unity of action is really important, as is equality of access. The things that we are going to provide to support governments with, and countries with, communities with, have to be made equally accessible to all, whether it's testing, whether it's treatment, diagnostics, medicines, other supplies. in many cases, in some communities, food and water. And we're going to probably see, unfortunately, in the coming weeks, some parts of the world where basic water and sanitation are not something people can take for granted, and that presents immense issues for an outbreak such as this. Responding where the needs are greatest and where people are most vulnerable is something we're tracking daily, and which we will be matching up the support that comes in through the response fund and other mechanisms to get what people need most to where it's most urgently needed. And then supporting the national government's response plan. And even as Margaret mentioned off the top, locally, but also nationally, where you can be part of the plans that are in place or that are shaping to help governments with what they need or with what they can't do as well as you can. What's not needed? Ignoring public health advice. We've seen some governments have to take stronger measures because people aren't heeding the public health advice. It's hugely important. Any role you can play in educating and informing your staff, your clients, your networks is really valued by us and by others, because that will help us deal with this as quickly, efficiently as we can and save as many people's lives and health as we can. Starting new initiatives where there are similar ones that already exist or things in place is another one. It's difficult sometimes. We know it's a complex world we live in. There's a lot of agendas, a lot of different things we need to be conscious of, but build on the existing, work together. And finally, this relates very much to the in-kind contributions. Donating things that do not meet quality standards is something we really have to try to avoid. So if you are repurposing, or if you are looking at producing or procuring things that you don't normally, look for the standards first. We have already received many offers that just do not meet WHO's quality standards, so they're not something that we can send to countries. We are working in tandem with the revised plan to make those specifications as easily and widely accessible in our dialogue with industry associations, so that whatever people are producing or contributing meets the standards, and we can accept it or help channel it to the people who need it. So that's a quick overview. I encourage you to follow, many of you probably are already, follow Dr. Tedros's press conferences. They're the best source of up-to-date information on the outbreak and key messages that the World Health Organization is highlighting, and our efforts. And we're very appreciative for those following our digital channels and working with our information to get that to your networks. And in a time like this, where, as you can imagine, just as many of you are, we're stretched. We really appreciate the expressions of solidarity and support that we're experiencing, and deeply appreciate it, even if we're not always able to respond to you in the quickest way possible. But that's what we're working on every day around the clock. I'll stop there and hand back to Andy. Thanks.
There are a lot of questions coming in that are more about how. And I'm just going to give one question to each of you, the panelists, about the how, which may provide some more inspiration. And we'll try to address them in this order, but please wait until I've asked the questions first. So the first question is on how can supply chains be better secured? And I think that there's also an implication there that how can those supply chains be better used? Hans-Peter, I guess that question is primarily for you. For Richard, how can businesses leverage their partnerships with their competitors, and especially to support local businesses or small, medium-sized businesses? Margaret, there's one here, I think it might be for you, about what businesses can do for the most vulnerable countries particularly in Africa. And for Joel, how can businesses contact WHO with their offers of support? Navroop, how can those experienced in remote working using digital technologies take their lessons to a wider community? So remembering we're looking at how. So if we could start with Hans-Peter, that would be wonderful. And we're trying to get to the other questions as well.
Thanks, Andy. I think when you were asking how can supply chains be better secured, you're referring to more to the question, how can we set up supply chains that are working as well under these conditions? Is that correct?
Yes, I presume that's right.
Okay. Well, I mean, the point is that supply chains are not regulated somehow, but they are usually subject to negotiations and agreements. And then the companies that are, the corporations that are building those supply chains have their network in place, like us, competitors. And at the end of the day, all together is the critical infrastructure. So I would think it is, as it is a matter of cost as well. And I mean, we are, you know, UPS is a corporation, so stock notified, so we need to make sure that we earn money as well. So I think no corporation can simply keep up a critical infrastructure without having clients that are filling it. So we always have to work with what we have. But what needs to be thought about is whether the way to set up warehouses and maybe to pre-position certain critical components that are needed right now, whether that can be done better. I mean, I read, and I'm not sure whether that is true, so maybe Joel is better suited to answer that question. I read that there were warnings from experts already 2 years ago or so that a type of this pandemic could occur. Now, we had a lot of discussions in the curse and after the last big crisis in Africa in 2014-15, and the discussion was about pre-positioning goods. The discussion was about pre-positioning protection material, PPEs. I think that's the magic abbreviation currently in all these discussions, PPEs and personal protection equipment. And the question is whether we have this supply, not the supply chain, but this supply somehow in stocks where we are able to, at the end of the day, weigh in very fast. I think that would be my answer.
Great, thanks very much. If everyone else could keep their answers as succinct as possible as well, so we can get through them. Richard, businesses leveraging partnerships with competitors.
Okay, so I think that Joel's point is absolutely the right one, and is at the top of everything we do. Is this going to be absolutely compliant with all the advice and guidance that we've been given by WHO and the local health and governmental authorities in the territories we operate in? The key to it is, in a sense, what I said before. The competitors that we have seen in the past are no longer our competitors, they're our allies. The SME and charitable sector that are so vital in the communities we serve have to be sustained. There has to be a grassroots industry there. And so therefore, open conversations about how we can work with those businesses to help them sustain what they do, and whether that's sharing news and information in our industry, giving them free advertising or revenue share type operations. And then when we move into the larger businesses, starting to talk to their trade associations, whether it's retail, leisure, technology, etc., finding out what we can do to help their businesses. But the more we work collectively, the more we break down the barriers, to those sort of open conversations, the more I think we'll be able to sustain the businesses that we all need to fuel the economy, and certainly are our core customers.
Thank you, Richard. Somebody's raised their hand. I'm just going to allow you to talk. I'm not sure who it is, but you now have your permission to talk. The person with the raised hand. No, okay.
Hi, my name is Anita Bieber. My question is for startups. It's Tom actually answered the funding part. We're startups, but my startup is actually working with communities on the ground to get whatever the needs of the people matched to the interest of volunteers. Right now, it's mostly for making masks at home. Some people are using their sewing machines. I don't know if that's, in terms of regulation, how that would even go. Other things are organizing a blood drive and actually getting groceries to the elderly. But how do we, I mean, we're just an early stage startup, we're barely starting, but it's obvious, it's already global. So how do we get the word out, sort of thing, without any huge marketing budget? Because I know funding will take a while to get.
Could you say your name, please?
Oh, sorry. My name is Anita Bieberg.
Thank you, Anita. Would any of the panelists like to try answering Anita's question?
I can respond to that.
Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, Anita, thank you, by the way, for the work you do and the efforts you're making. So two words very quickly to what you just said. A, social media, and B, crowdsourcing and crowdfunding, right? With what you're doing to get the word out there. So storytelling, effective storytelling, there are a lot of tools which are fun and creative to work with. But what you have now is the attention of the whole world. So think of that as a scarce asset, right? Which you have a limited quantity of, and you have the world that's looking at, you know, a certain direction, a certain thing. So tapping into that and sort of getting a little savvy about what that is, and bringing forth the stories and the wonderful work you're doing to the fore is the key here, right? So the quickest tools I could think of is social media and, like I said, crowdfunding. If you're looking for the support of the community in funding more of what you're doing, I think now is the time to make those asks. Yeah, those are 2 cents there.
Thank you, Navroop. Joel, we're going to go straight to you as well to answer this question. How can or should businesses contact WHO with the offers of support, or should they be looking elsewhere?
Thanks, Andy. Key question. And here we're trying to find a way to make this as workable and efficient as possible. So one of the things we've done in advance of this call was convened with the World Economic Forum a similar kind of call with a wide range of CEOs in the hundreds to try and bring the asks together in a succinct way that all can hear those asks and respond. And if you have a look at the action platform that they launched about a week ago, that's one of the main ways that we're trying to pull things together so that things don't get lost or delayed with WHO, where we don't have the capacity yet to respond to a bunch of individual requests. Someone mentioned near the beginning about working with business associations. This is hugely recommended. If you can bring those asks through business associations or those offers to WHO, that's a much easier way for us to dialogue. Also because given our existence as a member state organization and as a normative standard setting organization, we have to maintain, even in a time like this, a neutrality and dialogue, being in dialogue with industry associations and business associations like the International Chambers of Commerce allows us to have those conversations in a way that that works. I'd just like to briefly touch on a point that Hans Peter made around the supply and the example of PPE, personal protective equipment. Indeed, what we have seen is that the world wasn't prepared. These scenarios were predicted by health experts and others looking at what do we need to be prepared for. We sincerely hope, I think, as humanity, that we will learn and that some things that come out of this response are actually the preparedness. But as you can imagine, getting people to invest in preparedness is not the easiest thing. So the supply chain was one of the first things that we attended to, and the work is to put in place a global supply stockpile so that this would not be repeated in the same way, where a certain degree of needs, in the same way as we've done with our contingency fund for emergencies, there is a designated resource available for whatever needs, emergency needs be. In the same way, we're working to create a stockpile where through the global supply chain, the things that still work, and through identifying the most essential supplies, masks, gloves, gowns, sanitizer, these kinds of things, soap, there would be a certain amount that was in a global stockpile. I can circulate some slides, maybe Andy, with you that you could share with the group that illustrate this in a basic way, and then that would probably make some follow-up easier after that. Thanks.
Thank you, Joel. Yes, we'll be sharing a follow-up message with people who've registered for this call. I'm sure they would really appreciate those slides. Margaret, the question, just to repeat, what can businesses do for the most vulnerable countries, especially in Africa? Do you feel like you're in a position to be able to answer that question?
Sure, and I actually just posted the answer in the chat to avoid having to speak, to allow people conscious of time. But basically, the vulnerable populations, this isn't just about responding to specific groups in refugee camps or conflict areas. It's about dealing with entire countries whose national healthcare systems are weakened. Which will just put further strain on those. So from a business perspective, what you can do is work with the local governments and public local authorities and feed into the locally led responses, which have proven to be the most responsive. And another thing you can do is look at what has happened elsewhere, what's worked, what hasn't worked, learn from, people talk about the next kind of third wave that's going to hit Africa. Which is what the question was about, but really it's, wherever it is, you want to look and see, like Hans Peter had said, look and see what had worked in Asia and build upon those best practices. Also yesterday, the UN launched the Global Humanitarian Appeal, which is seeking $2 billion, which is largely going to be money from states to address the most vulnerable countries. And that money will be funneled to help those most in need, but then from a business perspective, you can work with the local businesses or local governments would be my suggestion. Local governments
through business associations, it seems to be the key message here. Navroop, if we could get you to touch on this question, and then we'll go back to maybe Joel for some final words. So the question for you is, how can those experienced in remote working take their lessons to a wider and more global community?
Yeah, so I think what we're seeing is a lot of blog posts, a lot of people posting again on professional social media like LinkedIn, etc., on what those lessons are like and how you could optimize time working remotely, right? And I do think just within your own circle, there is a lot you can share I mean, if there are memes that could go viral, then definitely suggestions on, working remotely could be useful for people. The most immediate thing I could think of is really these local hubs, right? Like the circles, your own circle, and the overlapping concentric social networks where you can share this. Of course, there are publications like Forbes and others that also publish stuff on what that means, right? To be working remotely in 2020 if you're in a lockdown. There's also venues where you can, depending on again what your whom you're connected to, take it out there in a slightly more formal manner. So that's sort of what I would say in terms of what that means to be working remotely. I think there is a lot of great lessons to be learned in terms of personal well-being, in terms of well-being of those around, and really what that means to have like a good work-life balance. So in a way that the crisis sort of refocuses attention on what we should be paying more attention to anyway, which is mental health, which is well-being, which is not just the economics, and speaking as an economist, but also the well-being of the society as a whole. So now is a great time to, push forward on that conversation globally.
Perhaps there's a partnership here where News UK, Forbes and others do a series of how to work from home. Here are some tools, here are some lessons. And maybe there's a partnership that could come out of this today. Who knows? Joel, would you mind saying a few last words before I close up?
Not at all. Thank you very much. And it's even to build on Navroop's comment and Margaret's comment about the vulnerable and people in need. There are a lot of people in the world who weren't necessarily in the best condition or the best circumstances before COVID-19, and this is not going to make their lives easier. And so it's really important, as Margaret mentioned, that we have the humanitarian appeal, that we not lose sight of that, but we somehow try and cover as much as we can and support governments and support health authorities. And this is where if your networks are strong in countries, please use those. Please, to the level that you are able to influence government in saying this is what we can bring that can support your response and reach the people who need help. Please do so, knowing that many governments are scrambling and some haven't even been engaged yet in the worst part of the outbreak. We don't know what things are going to look like on the other side, but where we can build, use this moment to build some perhaps new ways of working together, seems like one of the positive outcomes that we could take through the challenge, to be better set up to respond to people. And to Tom's point, he asked the question about lockdown. Dr. Tedros has really been clear from the start and consistent. It's an all society, all government approach. This is bigger than the health ministry. It's bigger than the World Health Organization. And it is, as much as possible, a comprehensive response. So working with authorities and knowing that all players have to try and focus together on what's needed, because no sector is going to be able to handle this alone. It affects us all, literally. So it's supporting that all government, all society approach, and as much as we can, not losing sight of the people who most need our help.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. I hope that you have some ideas now and things to follow up on. Thanks especially to the speakers, to Margaret, Hans-Peter, Richard, Navroop and Joel. and also to the partners Alliance4Impact, Meaningful Business and Impact17 for pulling this together so quickly. Most of all, thank you to all of you on the line who are trying to do the best that you can within your businesses and beyond your businesses to deal with the current situation. Please do get in touch with us afterwards. We'll be following up to saying thank you, and we'll be sharing the slides that Joel mentioned as well. But until then, stay safe, stay sane, and we'll see you on the other side.